Basically, what we're going to be looking at today is the relationship between the worship leader and the band, and basically how the two parties work together. What is it they're expecting of each other, and yeah, and then I'm going to talk about the role as an MD as well. So yeah, sorry, I've just been given a really distracting message at the back saying my fly's down. So I'm just going, no, it's not. It's Simon being a prat. Brilliant. Well, my name's Sam. This is Johnny, Jake, and Chris in the drum cage. We have to keep him in there for legal reasons. And they're going to be helping out with the workshop later. We're part of the worship team here at Soul Survivor Watford, and hopefully by the end of this next hour, we'll have learnt something from you, and you'll have given something. We'll have learnt something for you, and hopefully you'll be able to take something away as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is what the worship leader wants and expects from the band. I think the most important thing is awareness. And I say this ironically because I'm probably the most unaware person that you could possibly hope to meet, and I'm constantly accidentally putting myself in situations that I don't need to be in. I remember a few years ago, my uncle he's a prison chaplain, and I remember visiting his house in Nottingham once, and part of what he does is he, for people who've made a commitment to God inside prison, when they come out, he gets them into local churches. And so there was one lad that had come round to his house for lunch on the same time I did, who'd been with him to church that morning. And yeah, we were just going to have food together. So he told me at the door, "Look, Sam, I've got this lad. He's come with me to church this morning. He's just come out of prison, but he's a lovely guy. So just get to know him, just chat to him, be your normal, bubbly northern self." And so I did. I went, "Oh, hi, mate, how you doing? Like, how old are you? Where are you from? Have you got any brothers or sisters?" Questions just like, as you do to get to know people. It was at this point that my uncle called me through to the kitchen, and I know I've done something wrong, but I can't work out what. So I'm in the kitchen, and my uncle says to me, "You don't know what you've done, do you?" And I go, "No, why?" And he says, "What was Danny in prison for? I told you at the door." And I went, "No, you didn't." He said, "Yeah, I told you at the door. He was in prison for murdering his sister." And I'd asked him, "Has he got any siblings?" It's bad, that, isn't it? Now, my uncle had apparently told me at the door, he told me about the situation, but I was completely unaware, and I ended up putting my foot in it. It's so important as a band member to be aware of the worship leader and the rest of the band. It's so important to be aware of what instruments are playing. Maybe if the guitarist is playing a lead line, then the piano player needs to make sure that they're not playing something that clashes with that. They're playing something that is complementary to it. It's important to listen to other instruments, to know when someone needs to pull back for someone else to play out creatively, and also finding the time where there's space for you to maybe play a riff. Or whatever it is in a section of a song. Be aware of the worship leader as well, and watch for the direction that they are going through in the worship set. The role of the band member is to support the worship leader's vision and the worship leader's direction for that worship set. It's not to dictate it. It's not to it's not for Johnny to come out with some like heavy metal lead line if we're in the middle of Holy Spirit. It's just finding stuff that's going to complement where we're at in the worship set. Point number 2, preparedness. There's nothing that, and I know that some of you might have been in this situation as well, but there's nothing that I find more annoying than when maybe someone might have shown up not really prepared. They've kind of listened to the set list once through for a Sunday, but they don't really know the tracks. They don't really know what they're supposed to be playing. They don't know the chords, or maybe even how the song goes. But you see, preparedness doesn't take skill. It takes dedication. It takes the dedication to set aside time in the week to serve God, both in our preparation and also on a Sunday morning. And I think it's easy to think as well, I know that I'm guilty of this, to think that the team of worship can be a burden, but in truth it's not. It's not a burden to have to get to church for 8:30, 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. It's a privilege. It's an honor that we get to play a part in setting an atmosphere for people to worship and meet with God. So let's remember that when we prepare, in our preparation. Let's set aside enough time to properly learn our instruments and our parts to honour God and give support to the worship leader. Being prepared will also mean that we're arriving on Sunday mornings with better attitudes. It means that if we've come prepared, knowing the parts and knowing the chords for the songs that we're playing, that we don't have to arrive unsure or unconfident. And it means that when we're actually in the worship set, it means that we're not focusing on the chords. We're not worried about, oh, am I playing the right thing? Because we've done the work, we've done all the preparation, we know that we are. And it means that our worship from our instruments doesn't have to be me-focused or chords-focused, but it's God-focused. As much as preparedness is important, it is also to remember that mistakes happen no matter how prepared we are, and that's okay that they happen. I think my biggest blunder recently was a couple months ago. I was playing at a worship event in Surrey, and the backing track for Alive that we have is in the key of D, but we needed it in the key of G. There was a girl called Kaz who was leading worship, and so we had to transpose it. But I transposed it incorrectly and put it into A. At the same time as well, we'd just finished The Way, and Tom had forgotten to change his capo. So Tom was playing acoustic and singing in B. The track was coming out in A, and us musicians were playing in G. So we just got hit with this wall of absolute clashing sound that nobody ever, I wouldn't wish you to hear it ever again. It was horrific. But mistakes are bound to happen. And it's just a part of being human. However, coming prepared and knowing the songs means that when problems do happen, we're in a much better position to resolve them and to deal with them. My third point is it's important for the worship leader that the band are communicating and are listening. In order for the worship leader to fully focus on the congregation that we're serving, they need to know that behind them is a band that are communicating and listening to one another. So let's say hypothetically, there's no one in the band that was listening to each other at all, and everyone at once decided, oh, this is my moment. This is my moment to play out and take a lead. It might sound something as ridiculous as this. Bro. That actually sounded quite good. That's a shame. But what they're playing individually is great, but when it's combined together, it just creates mess, it creates clutter. And I know that's an extreme example, but the band need to be listening to each other and communicating with one another in order to get that clean mix for someone to know when it's their moment to play out, when it's their moment to pull back. And just work together as a team, not as individuals. It's just important because it means that when we're communicating, when we're listening, it means that the bassist and the drummer, they can work together. They can make sure that the kick pattern is in line with the rhythm that the bass is playing. It means that, let's say, two electric guitarists are on. It means that they're looking at each other and they're listening to know that they're not playing on top of each other, they're not playing the same thing, but they're in different registers on the guitar. They're complementing one another instead of conflicting. And the worship leader also needs the band to be communicating with them. The main way that we do that here, and you might recognize some of these, but Tom has a few little tricks that are like his body language cues. So if he wants us to repeat a section, you'll see him stand on his leg like a flamingo. You can see all this in the celebration tonight, and you'll just be like, oh, I know where you're going. Yeah, I've seen the leg. So he'll stick his leg up, or if he wants to bring everything down dynamically, you'll see him pull his guitar up like that. And also, he might stomp his foot. If we've gone from a quieter section, we might want to build it up, and he'll stomp his foot to initiate that. And I think that's really important because it just means that if the worship leader is intentional and they know where they want to take the song, it makes it so much easier for the band because they can see it displays the vision of the worship leader so much more clearly. Brilliant. The next section, I want to invite these guys to come and share with us. This is about what the band want from the worship leader, so I thought it'd be great to get perspective from these guys. So, over to you.
So as a bassist or as a band member, there are really two things that I would try and emphasize as you worship leaders or band members to try and do to help us out. The first of all being relationship. So making sure that before you're turning up to a Sunday, before you're turning up to a worship gathering, before you're leading your band in worship, that there is already that relationship established. So whether that's during midweek stuff, whether that's during rehearsals, whether that's just during hanging out, making sure that you're intentionally getting to know your band members is building that relationship up, so that when you get there on a Sunday, that relationship is already there, and you're not trying to build on something that isn't there already. And my second point is actually preparedness again. So, but this time making sure that the worship leaders are getting the set lists out 3 or 4 days before the service, so that actually that you can have the expectation for your band members to have learned the songs, to have learned the parts, to learn everything that they need to learn. So that's the two things for me really, is just that relationship, the expectation of relationship, and that expectation of preparedness in planning sets.
Yeah, for me, I'd agree with everything that Jake said. Like, yeah, having that relationship between the worship leader and the rest of the band is really important. And kind of like, that's really important. It just helps with everything. So say, like, yeah, getting a set for me is really useful. But if you've got that relationship and you're able to be like, okay, like, have you got a set sort of thing, is helpful. And then when you're rehearsing, like, with the worship leader, them also having a good knowledge of the songs and the parts. Like, obviously they're not going to know all the parts for every instrument, but having an overview of them and being able to have some input onto what you're playing, but also having a bit of a balance of like having some input on what they want from the musicians, but also respecting that, like, that's our instrument and we've put the work in and learnt the parts and stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, all of that's really good. Just to reinforce that, like, prep is really important from a musical perspective, but also from a perspective of worship. And that is to say that hopefully a set hasn't been pulled out of the air 2 minutes before. Hopefully there's been some prayer that's gone into it. Hopefully you're headed somewhere in that set. And communicating that to musicians is so helpful in terms of how we worship, what we're going to be doing, how we're going to be playing the songs. Yeah, hugely important. I've also written down musical language and communication. Sometimes, as a worship leader, you can know what you want, but not quite have the words to express it. And so building up a vocabulary that's going to be useful for everybody, that everybody understands, is also hugely important. Yeah, just finding words and phrases that a guitarist would understand or a keys player would understand, or, you know, just stock phrases like that. Yeah, a leader who's mindful of musical arrangement as well is really, really good. You're not always going to be playing stuff exactly how it is on the CD. But yeah, an overall vision musically is also really, really helpful in terms of what we should be doing, what we should be playing. But yeah.
Cheers, guys. Yeah, that's brilliant. I think one thing I'd maybe add to that is I mentioned it before about being really intentional with leading and the importance of, even maybe when, as a worship leader, you might maybe you don't feel well one morning, but you have to lead worship, and so you don't feel quite as confident, that there's such an emphasis on being intentional with the directions that you give to the band. Just because if, for example, Tom might if he was to give a very half-hearted kick of the leg, he wants to repeat a section, but it's not clear and it's not obvious. So any one of us could easily miss it, and it could just put us all completely on the wrong page. So I think clear decision making in the worship sets is brilliant and is really helpful for a band for taking it wherever the worship leader wants to go. Brilliant. Last thing I want to talk about is the role of the MD. So the role of the music director is to take responsibility for the backline musicians. Their job is to free up the worship leader to focus on the congregation and not having to lead the band. The MD's job, this is really important, is not to be a worship leader. They communicate the direction that the worship leader is heading to the rest of the band. So let's say Tom again uses his body language for a cue. I might read that, and then I can say in my microphone that isn't in these speakers, but's in our little earphones, Tom's just stuck his leg out, repeat the section, or something like that. Also, the MD is responsible for giving any direction that may be needed, such as chord structures, lead lines, maybe instrumentation in certain sections, whether we're just dropping it down to keys, whether it's full band, drums and bass, whatever it might be, and also communicating dynamics and stuff. There was a little example of the chord structures this morning where we were doing Set a Fire, where the chords are G, C, E minor, C, but we brought in C, D, E minor, G over B, and I think it's just so important. It's brilliant having the MD microphone because it means that we can call that and everyone can be on the same page, as opposed to maybe hitting the first chord a bit messy and then realizing, oh wait, we've changed the chord structures, and then everyone picks up after that. And then during the worship set, if the worship leader decides to go away from maybe the standard arrangement, whether they're repeating a bridge, whether they're bringing it down dynamically, or any one of the other million spontaneous things that worship leaders like to do, then the music director can look for that cue from the worship leader and communicate it to the rest of the band, and it just makes sure everybody's on the same page. The main thing to remember is that the MD falls under the role of the worship leader. The worship leader is the one that's in charge, and anything that the worship leader says is what the MD is communicating to the rest of the band to execute it. It's not that the music director thinks, right, I think we should build here. It's watching out for the worship leader and trying to articulate what it is the worship leader wants to do, and where they see the Spirit moving. It's for that reason the MD and the worship leader, they need to communicate before times of worship, so that the worship leader has kind of communicated the potential ideas or arrangements of the songs, and that the MD knows to watch out for any cues that might be spontaneous.